Chapter 38 of the Golden Bowl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Golden Bowl by Henry James. Book 5, Chapter 38. Maggie was to feel, after this passage, how they had both been helped through it by the influence of that accident of her having been caught, a few nights before, in the familiar embrace of her father's wife. His return to the saloon had chanced to coincide exactly with this demonstration, missed moreover neither by her husband nor by the Assinghams, who, their card-party suspended, had quitted the billiard-room with him. She had been conscious enough at the time of what such an impression, received by the others, might in that extended state do for her case, and none the less that, as no one had appeared to wish to be the first to make a remark about it, it had taken on perceptibly the special shade of consecration conferred by unanimities of silence. The effect, she might have considered, had been almost awkward. The promptitude of her separation from Charlotte, as if they had been discovered in some absurdity, on her becoming aware of spectators. The spectators, on the other hand, that was the appearance, mightn't have supposed them, in the existing relation, addicted to mutual endearments, and yet, hesitating with a fine scruple between sympathy and hilarity, must have felt that almost any spoken or laughed comment could be kept from sounding vulgar only by sounding, beyond any permitted measure, intelligent. They had evidently looked, the two young wives, like a pair of women making up effusively, as women were supposed to do, especially when approved fools, after a broil. But taking note of the reconciliation would imply on her father's part, on Amerigo's, and on Fanny Assingham's, some proportionate vision of the grounds of their indifference. There had been something, there had been but too much in the incident, for each observer. Yet there was nothing any one could have said without seeming essentially to say, "See, the dear things, their quarrel's blissfully over." "Our quarrel? What quarrel?" the dear things themselves would necessarily, in that case, have demanded, and the wits of the others would thus have been called upon for some agility of exercise. No one had been equal to the flight of producing, off-hand, a fictive reason for any estrangement, to take, that is, the place of the true, which had so long, for the finer sensibility, pervaded the air. And every one, accordingly, not to be inconveniently challenged, was pretending, immediately after, to have remarked nothing that any one else hadn't. Maggie's own measure had remained, all the same, full of the reflection caught from the total inference, which had acted, virtually, by enabling every one present, and Charlotte not least, to draw a long breath. The message of the little scene had been different for each, but it had been this, markedly, all round, that it reinforced even immensely, the general effort, carried on from week to week, and of late distinctly more successful, to look and talk and move as if nothing in life were the matter. Supremely, however, while this glass was held up to her, had Maggie's sense turned to the quality of the success constituted, on the spot, for Charlotte. Most of all, if she was guessing how her father must have secretly started, how her husband must have secretly wondered, how Fanny Assingham must have secretly, in a flash, seen daylight for herself, most of all had she tasted, by communication, of the high profit involved for her companion. She felt, in all her pulses, Charlotte feel it, and how publicity had been required, absolutely, to crown her own abasement. It was the added touch, and now nothing was wanting, which, to do her stepmother justice, Mrs. Verver had appeared but to desire, from that evening, to show with the last vividness that she recognised. Maggie lived over again the minutes in question, had found herself repeatedly doing so, to the degree that the whole evening hung together, to her after-sense, as a thing appointed by some occult power that had dealt with her, that had, for instance, animated the four with just the right restlessness too, had decreed and directed and exactly timed it in them, making their game of bridge, however abysmal a face it had worn for her, give way, precisely, to their common unavowed impulse to find out, to emulate Charlotte's impatience. A preoccupation, this latter, attached detectedly to the member of the party who was roaming in her queerness and was, for all their simulated blindness, not roaming unnoted. If Mrs. Verver meanwhile, then, had struck her as determined in a certain direction by the last felicity into which that night had flowered, our young woman was yet not to fail of appreciating the truth that she had not been put at ease after all with absolute permanence. Maggie had seen her unmistakably desire to rise to the occasion and be magnificent, seen her decide that the right way for this would be to prove that the reassurance she had extorted there, under the high, cool lustre of the saloon, a twinkle of crystal and silver, had not only poured oil upon the troubled waters of their question, but had fairly drenched their whole intercourse with that lubricant. She had exceeded the limit of discretion in this insistence on her capacity to repay in proportion a service she acknowledged as handsome. Why handsome? Maggie would have been free to ask, since if she had been veracious the service assuredly would not have been huge. It would in that case have come up vividly, and for each of them alike, that the truth, on the Princess's lips, presented no difficulty. If the latter's mood, in fact, could have turned itself at all to private gaiety, it might have failed to resist the diversion of seeing so clever a creature so beguiled. Charlotte's theory of a generous manner was manifestly to express that her stepdaughter's word, wiping out, as she might have said, everything, had restored them to the serenity of a relation without a cloud. It had been, in short, in this light, ideally conclusive, so that no ghost of anything it referred to could ever walk again. What was the ecstasy of that, however, but in itself a trifle compromising? As truly, within the week, Maggie had occasion to suspect her friend of beginning, and rather abruptly, to remember. Convinced as she was of the example already given her by her husband, and in relation to which her profession of trust in his mistress had been an act of conformity exquisitely calculated, her imagination yet sought in the hidden play of his influence the explanation of any change of surface, any difference of expression or intention. There had been, through life, as we know, few quarters in which the Princess's fancy could let itself loose, but it shook off restraint when it plunged into the figured void of the detail of that relation. This was a realm it could people with images, again and again with fresh ones. They swarmed there like the strange combinations that lurked in the woods at twilight. They loomed into the definite and faded into the vague, their main present sign for her being, however, that they were always, that they were duskily, agitated. Her earlier vision of a state of bliss made insecure by the very intensity of the bliss, this had dropped from her. She had ceased to see, as she lost herself, the pair of operatic, of high Wagnerian lovers she found deep within her these comparisons, interlocked in their wood of enchantment, a green glade as romantic as one's dream of an old German forest. The picture was veiled, on the contrary, with the dimness of trouble, behind which she felt, indistinguishable, the procession of forms that had lost, also pitifully, their precious confidence. Therefore, though there was in these days, for her, with Amerigo, little enough even of the imitation, from day to day, of unembarrassed references, as she had foreseen, for that matter, from the first, that there would be, her active conception of his accessibility to their companion's own private and unextinguished right to break ground was not much less active than before. So it was that her inner sense, in spite of everything, represented him as still pulling wires and controlling currents, or rather indeed as muffling the whole possibility, keeping it down and down, leading his accomplice continually on to some new turn of the road. As regards herself, Maggie had become more conscious from week to week of his ingenuities of intention to make up to her for their forfeiture, in so dire a degree, of any reality of frankness, a privation that had left on his lips perhaps a little of the same thirst with which she fairly felt her own distorted, the torment of the lost pilgrim who listens in desert sands for the possible, the impossible, plash of water. It was just this hampered state in him, none the less, that she kept before her when she wished most to find grounds of dignity for the hard little passion which nothing he had done could smother. There were hours enough, lonely hours, in which she let dignity go. Then there were others when, clinging with her winged concentration to some deep cell of her heart, she stored away her hived tenderness as if she had gathered it all from flowers. He was walking ostensibly beside her, but in fact given over, without a break, to the grey medium in which he helplessly groped. A perception on her part which was a perpetual pang, and which might last what it would, for ever if need be, but which, if relieved at all, must be relieved by his act alone. She herself could do nothing more for it. She had done the utmost possible. It was meantime not the easier to bear for this aspect under which Charlotte was presented as depending on him for guidance, taking it from him even in doses of bitterness, and yet lost with him in devious depths. Nothing was thus more sharply to be inferred than that he had promptly enough warned her, on hearing from her of the precious assurance received from his wife, that she must take care her satisfaction didn't betray something of her danger. Maggie had a day of still waiting, after allowing him time to learn how unreservedly she had lied for him, of waiting as for the light of she scarce knew what slow shining reflection of this knowledge in his personal attitude. What retarded evolution, she asked herself in these hours, mightn't poor Charlotte, all unwittingly, have precipitated? She was thus poor Charlotte again for Maggie, even while Maggie's own head was bowed, and the reason for this kept coming back to our young woman in the conception of what would secretly have passed. She saw her, face to face with the Prince, take from him the chill of his stiffest admonition, with the possibilities of deeper difficulty that it represented for each. She heard her ask, irritated and sombre, what tone, in God's name, since her bravery didn't suit him, she was then to adopt. And by way of a fantastic flight of divination, she heard Amerigo reply, in a voice of which every fine note, familiar and admirable, came home to her, that one must really manage such prudences a little for one's self. It was positive in the Princess that for this she breathed Charlotte's cold air, turned away from him in it with her, turned with her, in growing compassion, this way and that, hovered behind her while she felt her ask herself where then she should rest. Marvellous the manner in which, under such imaginations, Maggie thus circled and lingered, quite as if she were materially following her unseen, counting every step she helplessly wasted, noting every hindrance that brought her to a pause. A few days of this, accordingly, had wrought a change in that apprehension of the instant beatitude of triumph magnanimous and serene, with which the upshot of the night scene on the terrace had condemned our young woman to make terms. She had had, as we know, her vision of the gilt bars bent, of the door of the cage forced open from within and the creature imprisoned roaming at large, of movement on the creature's part that was to have even, for the short interval, its impressive beauty, but of which the limit, and in yet another direction, had loomed straight into view during her last talk under the great trees with her father. It was when she saw his wife's face ruefully attached to the quarter to which, in the course of their session, he had so significantly addressed his own, it was then that Maggie could watch for its turning pale. It was then she seemed to know what she had meant by thinking of her, in the shadow of his most ominous reference, as doomed. If, as I say, her attention now, day after day, so circled and hovered, it found itself arrested for certain passages during which she absolutely looked with Charlotte's grave eyes. What she unfailingly made out through them was the figure of a little quiet gentleman who mostly wore, as he moved, alone, across the field of vision, a straw hat, a white waistcoat, and a blue necktie, keeping a cigar in his teeth and his hands in his pockets, and who, oftener than not, presented a somewhat meditative back while he slowly measured the perspectives of the park and broodingly counted, it might have appeared, his steps. There were hours of intensity for a week or two, when it was for all the world as if she had guardedly tracked her stepmother, in the great house, from room to room and from window to window, only to see her, here and there and everywhere, try her uneasy outlook, question her issue and her fate. Something unmistakably had come up for her that had never come up before. It represented a new complication and had begotten a new anxiety. Things, these, that she carried about with her done up in the napkin of her lover's accepted rebuke, while she vainly hunted for some corner where she might put them safely down. The disguised solemnity, the prolonged futility of her search might have been grotesque to a more ironic eye, but Maggie's provision of irony, which we have taken for naturally small, had never been so scant as now, and there were moments while she watched with her, thus unseen, when the mere effect of being near her was to feel her own heart in her throat, was to be almost moved to saying to her, "Hold on tight, my poor dear, without too much terror, and it will all come out somehow." Even to that indeed, she could reflect, Charlotte might have replied that it was easy to say. Even to that no great meaning could attach so long as the little meditative man in the straw hat kept coming into view with his indescribable air of weaving his spell, weaving it off there by himself. In whatever quarter of the horizon the appearances were scanned he was to be noticed as absorbed in this occupation, and Maggie was to become aware of 2 or 3 extraordinary occasions of receiving from him the hint that he measured the impression he produced. It was not really till after their recent long talk in the park that she knew how deeply, how quite exhaustively, they had then communicated, so that they were to remain together for the time, in consequence, quite in the form of a couple of sociable drinkers who sit back from the table over which they have been resting their elbows, over which they have emptied to the last drop their respective charged cups. The cups were still there on the table, but turned upside down, and nothing was left for the companions but to confirm by placid silences the fact that the wine had been good. They had parted positively, as if, on either side, primed with it, primed for whatever was to be, and everything between them, as the month waned, added its touch of truth to this similitude. Nothing truly was at present between them save that they were looking at each other in infinite trust. It fairly wanted no more words, and when they met, during the deep summer days, met even without witnesses, when they kissed at morning and evening, or on any of the other occasions of contact that they had always so freely celebrated, a pair of birds of the upper air could scarce have appeared less to invite each other to sit down and worry afresh. So it was that in the house itself, where more of his waiting treasures than ever were provisionally ranged, she sometimes only looked at him, from end to end of the great gallery, the pride of the house, for instance, as if, in one of the halls of a museum, she had been an earnest young woman with a Baedeker, and he a vague gentleman to whom even Baedekers were unknown. He had ever, of course, had his way of walking about to review his possessions and verify their condition, but this was a pastime to which he now struck her as almost extravagantly addicted, and when she passed near him, and he turned to give her a smile, she caught, or so she fancied, the greater depth of his small, perpetual hum of contemplation. It was as if he were singing to himself, sotto voce, as he went, and it was also, on occasion, quite ineffably, as if Charlotte, hovering, watching, listening, on her side too, kept sufficiently within earshot to make it out as song, and yet, for some reason connected with the very manner of it, stood off and didn't dare. One of the attentions she had from immediately after her marriage most freely paid him was that of her interest in his rarities, her appreciation of his taste, her native passion for beautiful objects and her grateful desire not to miss anything he could teach her about them. Maggie had in due course seen her begin to work this fortunately natural source of sympathy for all it was worth. She took possession of the mound throughout its extent. She abounded, to odd excess, one might have remarked, in the assumption of its being for her, with her husband, all the ground, the finest, clearest air and most breathable medium common to them. It had been given to Maggie to wonder if she didn't, in these intensities of approbation, too much shut him up to his province; but this was a complaint he had never made his daughter, and Charlotte must at least have had for her that, thanks to her admirable instinct, her range of perception marching with his own and never falling behind, she had probably not so much as once treated him to a rasping mistake or a revealing stupidity. Maggie, wonderfully, in the summer days, felt it forced upon her that that was one way, after all, of being a genial wife. And it was never so much forced upon her as at these odd moments of her encountering the sposi, as Amerigo called them, under the cove ceilings of Fawns while, so together, yet at the same time so separate, they were making their daily round. Charlotte hung behind, with emphasized attention. She stopped when her husband stopped, but at the distance of a case or two, or of whatever other succession of objects; and the likeness of their connection would not have been wrongly figured if he had been thought of as holding in one of his pocketed hands the end of a long silken halter looped round her beautiful neck. He didn't twitch it, yet it was there; he didn't drag her, but she came; and those indications that I have described the Princess as finding extraordinary in him were two or three mute facial intimations which his wife's presence didn't prevent his addressing his daughter, nor prevent his daughter, as she passed, it was doubtless to be added, from flushing a little at the receipt of. They amounted perhaps only to a wordless smile, but the smile was the soft shake of the twisted silken rope, and Maggie's translation of it, held in her breast till she got well away, came out only, as if it might have been overheard, when some door was closed behind her. "Yes, you see, I lead her now by the neck. I lead her to her doom, and she doesn't so much as know what it is, though she has a fear in her heart which, if you had the chances to apply your ear there that I, as a husband, have, you would hear thump and thump and thump. She thinks it may be her doom, the awful place over there, awful for her; but she's afraid to ask, don't you see? Just as she's afraid of not asking. Just as she's afraid of so many other things that she sees multiplied round her now as portents and betrayals. She'll know, however, when she does know." Charlotte's one opportunity, meanwhile, for the air of confidence she had formerly worn so well, and that agreed so with her firm and charming type, was the presence of visitors, never, as the season advanced, wholly intermitted; rather, in fact, so constant, with all the people who turned up for luncheon and for tea and to see the house, now replete, now famous, that Maggie grew to think again of this large element of company as of a kind of renewed water supply for the tank in which, like a party of panting goldfish, they kept afloat. It helped them unmistakably with each other, weakening the emphasis of so many of the silences of which their intimate intercourse would otherwise have consisted. Beautiful and wonderful for her, even, at times, was the effect of these interventions; their effect above all in bringing home to each the possible heroism of perfunctory things. They learned fairly to live in the perfunctory; they remained in it as many hours of the day as might be; it took on finally the likeness of some spacious central chamber in a haunted house, a great overarched and overglazed rotunda, where gaiety might reign, but the doors of which opened into sinister circular passages. Here they turned up for each other, as they said, with the blank faces that denied any uneasiness felt in the approach; here they closed numerous doors carefully behind them, all save the door that connected the place, as by a straight tinted corridor, with the outer world, and, encouraging thus the irruption of society, imitated the aperture through which the bedizened performers of the circus are poured into the ring. The great part Mrs. Verver had socially played came, luckily, Maggie could make out, to her assistance. She had personal friends; Charlotte's personal friends had ever been, in London, at the two houses, one of the most convenient pleasantries, who actually tempered, at this crisis, her aspect of isolation; and it wouldn't have been hard to guess that her best moments were those in which she suffered no fear of becoming a bore to restrain her appeal to their curiosity. Their curiosity might be vague, but their clever hostess was distinct, and she marched them about, sparing them nothing, as if she counted, each day, on a harvest of half-crowns. Maggie met her again, in the gallery, at the oddest hours, with the party she was entertaining. heard her draw out the lesson, insist upon the interest, snub even the particular presumption and smile for the general bewilderment, inevitable features, these latter, of almost any occasion, in a manner that made our young woman, herself incurably dazzled, marvel afresh at the mystery by which a creature who could be in some connections so earnestly right could be in others so perversely wrong. When her father, vaguely circulating, was attended by his wife, it was always Charlotte who seemed to bring up the rear, but he hung in the background when she did cicerone, and it was then perhaps that, moving mildly and modestly to and fro on the skirts of the exhibition, his appearance of weaving his spell was, for the initiated conscience, least to be resisted. Brilliant women turned to him in vague emotion, but his response scarce committed him more than if he had been the person employed to see that, after the invading wave was spent, the cabinets were all locked and the symmetries all restored. There was a morning when, during the hour before luncheon and shortly after the arrival of a neighbourly contingent, neighbourly from 10 miles off, whom Mrs. Verver had taken in charge, Maggie paused on the threshold of the gallery through which she had been about to pass, faltered there for the very impression of his face as it met her from an opposite door. Charlotte, halfway down the vista, held together, as if by something almost austere in the grace of her authority, the semi-scared, now that they were there, knot of her visitors, who, since they had announced themselves by telegram as yearning to inquire and admire, saw themselves restricted to this consistency. Her voice, high and clear and a little hard, reached her husband and her stepdaughter while she thus placed beyond doubt her cheerful submission to duty. Her words, addressed to the largest publicity, rang for some minutes through the place, every one as quiet to listen as if it had been a church ablaze with tapers, and she were taking her part in some hymn of praise. Fanny Assingham looked rapt in devotion, Fanny Assingham who forsook this other friend as little as she forsook either her host, or the Princess, or the Prince, or the Principino. She supported her, in slow revolutions, and murmurous attestations of presence, at all such times, and Maggie, advancing after a first hesitation, was not to fail of noting her solemn, inscrutable attitude, her eyes attentively lifted, so that she might escape being provoked to betray an impression. She betrayed one, however, as Maggie approached, dropping her gaze to the latter's level long enough to seem to adventure, marvellously, on a mute appeal. "You understand, don't you, that if she didn't do this there would be no knowing what she might do?" This light Mrs. Assingham richly launched while her younger friend, unresistingly moved, became uncertain again, and then, not too much to show it, or rather positively to conceal it, and to conceal something more as well, turned short round to one of the windows and awkwardly, pointlessly waited. "The largest of the three pieces has the rare peculiarity that the garlands, looped round it, which, as you see, are the finest possible vieux Saxe, are not of the same origin or period, or even, wonderful as they are, of a taste quite so perfect. They've been put on at a later time, by a process of which there are very few examples, and none so important as this, which is really quite unique, so that, though the whole thing is a little baroque, its value as a specimen is, I believe, almost inestimable." So the high voice quavered, aiming truly at effects far over the heads of gaping neighbours. So the speaker, piling it up, sticking at nothing, as less interested judges might have said, seemed to justify the faith with which she was honoured. Maggie, meanwhile, at the window, knew the strangest thing to be happening. She had turned suddenly to crying, or was at least on the point of it, the lighted square before her all blurred and dim. The high voice went on. Its quaver was doubtless for conscious ears only, but there were verily 30 seconds during which it sounded, for our young woman, like the shriek of a soul in pain. Kept up a minute longer it would break and collapse, so that Maggie felt herself, the next thing, turn with a start to her father. "Can't she be stopped? Hasn't she done it enough?" Some such question as that she let herself ask him to suppose in her. Then it was that across half the gallery, for he had not moved from where she had first seen him, he struck her as confessing, with strange tears in his own eyes, to sharp identity of emotion. "Poor thing, poor thing!" It reached straight. "Isn't she for one's credit on the swagger?" After which, as held thus together they had still another strained minute, the shame, the pity, the better knowledge, the smothered protest, the divined anguish even, so overcame him that, blushing to his eyes, he turned short away. The affair but of a few muffled moments, this snatched communion yet lifted Maggie as on air; so much for deep guesses on her own side, too, it gave her to think of. There was honestly an awful mixture in things, and it was not closed to her after-sense of such passages we have already indeed, in other cases, seen it open that the deepest depth of all, and a perceived penalty, was that you couldn't be sure some of your compunctions and contortions wouldn't show for ridiculous. Amerigo, that morning, for instance, had been as absent as he at this juncture appeared to desire he should mainly be noted as being. He had gone to London for the day and the night, a necessity that now frequently rose for him, and that he had more than once suffered to operate during the presence of guests, successions of pretty women, the theory of his fond interest in whom had been publicly cultivated. It had never occurred to his wife to pronounce him ingenuous, but there came at last a high dim August dawn when she couldn't sleep, and when, creeping restlessly about and breathing at her window the coolness of wooded acres, she found the faint flush of the east marsh with the perception of that other almost equal prodigy. It rosily coloured her vision that, even such as he was, yes, her husband could on occasion sin by excess of candour. He wouldn't otherwise have given as his reason for going up to Portland Place in the August days that he was arranging books there. He had bought a great many of late, and he had had others, a large number, sent from Rome, wonders of old print in which her father had been interested. But when her imagination tracked him to the dusty town, to the house where drawn blinds and pale shrouds, where a caretaker and a kitchen maid were alone in possession, it wasn't to see him, in his shirt-sleeves, unpacking battered boxes. She saw him, in truth, less easily beguiled, saw him wander, in the closed, dusky rooms, from place to place, or else, for long periods, recline on deep sofas and stare before him through the smoke of ceaseless cigarettes. She made him out as liking better than anything in the world just now to be alone with his thoughts. Being herself connected with his thoughts, she continued to believe, more than she had ever been, it was thereby a good deal as if he were alone with her. She made him out as resting so from that constant strain of the perfunctory to which he was exposed at Fawns, and she was accessible to the impression of the almost beggared aspect of this alternative. It was like his doing penance in sordid ways, being sent to prison or being kept without money. It wouldn't have taken much to make her think of him as really kept without food. He might have broken away, might easily have started to travel. He had a right, thought wonderful Maggie now, to so many more freedoms than he took. His secret was of course that at Fawns he all the while winced, was all the while in presence and respect to which he had thrown himself back, with a hard pressure, on whatever mysteries of pride, whatever inward springs familiar to the man of the world, he could keep from snapping. Maggie, for some reason, had that morning, while she watched the sunrise, taken an extraordinary measure of the ground on which he would have had to snatch at pretext for absence. It all came to her there, he got off to escape from a sound. The sound was in her own ears still, that of Charlotte's high coerced quaver before the cabinets in the hushed gallery, the voice by which she herself had been pierced the day before as by that of a creature in anguish, and by which, while she sought refuge at the blurred window, the tears had been forced into her eyes. Her comprehension soared so high that the wonder for her became really his not feeling the need of wider intervals and thicker walls. Before that admiration she also meditated. Consider as she might now, she kept reading not less into what he omitted than into what he performed a beauty of intention that touched her fairly the more by being obscure. It was like hanging over a garden in the dark. Nothing was to be made of the confusion of growing things, but one felt they were folded flowers, and their vague sweetness made the whole air their medium. He had to turn away, but he wasn't at least a coward. He would wait on the spot for the issue of what he had done on the spot. She sank to her knees with her arm on the ledge of her window-seat, where she blinded her eyes from the full glare of seeing that his idea could only be to wait, whatever might come, at her side. It was to her buried face that she thus, for a long time, felt him draw nearest; though after a while, when the strange wail of the gallery began to repeat its inevitable echo, she was conscious of how that brought out his pale, hard grimace. Chapter 38.